The rivalry is back on.
Welcome back to another episode of the Bring the Juice podcast. Derek Larger joining me. Cody Felger here as always. Joining us, special guest from StampyBlue.com, Mr. Zach Hicks. Zach, how are you doing?
Pretty good, man. I appreciate you guys accommodating for my schedule here, but I'm glad that we were able to get this, get me on this week here on Monday. So appreciate you guys, and I'm glad to be on the show today.
Absolutely, Zach. And I know that you, a couple weeks ago were down in Mobile, Alabama to watch the Senior Bowl. You've really been doing a lot of draft stuff, working and just looking at different prospects that could be associated with the Colts. So kind of what I wanted to do, Zach, is kind of run through some of these picks, through all the picks that the Colts have in the 2020 draft, and kind of look at some guys that maybe you have slated and you've looked at and you think could potentially be good fits for what the Colts need. Obviously, free agency hasn't come yet, so some of these needs, similar to Derek's mock draft, some of these needs could be, fixed in free agency or addressed in free agency. But as it stands right now, I just kind of wanted to look at some of the prospects that you think could potentially be, good fits with the Colts. And so we'll start here, Zach, with obviously the first round pick, number 13th overall. As it stands right now, I know, Zach, that you're a big Jordan Love guy. And you can comment on Love and comment on some of the other guys. Who do you think are some good fits here for the Colts at number 13 overall, if they choose to stay there?
Yeah, so, if they stay at 13, I think the biggest position of need and the one thing they really need to address is just the quarterback position. We saw a lot last year. I know a lot of people are still kind of high on Brissett, but, at the end of the day, it just wasn't getting done with him at quarterback. And, people throw the injury out there, the knee injury, but even before that, telltale signs there, we're there for regression. So overall, I just don't think Jacoby Brissett's the answer. And honestly, we've seen a lot from NFL media. We've seen a lot of rumors and speculations, and even Vegas, I think, has the Colts up there for taking Rivers or taking, quarterback in this draft. So there's a lot of smoke, and usually where there's smoke, there's fire. So I think that, this first pick here, especially at 13, maybe even a trade up, the number one target really has to be a quarterback. Maybe Tua slips because the medicals don't check out, or maybe not check out, but aren't as amazing as what, teams would like in the first round. So maybe he slips a little bit, and, getting that kind of talent at 13 would be great. Jordan Love, like you said, I'm super high on Jordan Love. I think down in Mobile, he wasn't outstanding, but you could see the arm talent and the traits that we could all see on tape. So I really would like Jordan Love at 13, especially under Reich's tutelage there here in Indy and behind that offensive line. And then Justin Herbert, if he somehow slips, I think he's going to go pretty high. But, for whatever reason, if he slips, there's teams that like different flavors at quarterback. So if he slips at 13, I think that's another obvious choice, just because he's kind of similar to Jordan Love when it comes to having all those traits, not really a finished product, but, behind a really good offensive line, a really good running game, and with Frank Reich's tutelage, I think that he'd be really good. So I think quarterback is the obvious thing to look at there in the first round, and there's going to be a couple good options there at 13.
All right, and Cody, we'll talk about the next one here in a second, but I did want to ask you, Zach, because that was going to lead me right into where I wanted to ask you. If you did have the option to go with a Justin Herbert or Jordan Love, me personally, I would love Justin Herbert on the Colts. I've been a huge fan of his all this year, and looking at the tape and thinking of some of the potential that he has, I would think he's a little bit more of a fine prospect than a Jordan Love. I see where people are getting at Jordan Love because, obviously that's the most likely scenario that we get a Jordan Love, but I would love to get a Justin Herbert on this team. Which one would you prefer to have in the Colts system if you had the choice?
Yeah, so to preface this, Justin Herbert is a very good quarterback prospect. He checks a lot of the boxes on and off the field. He has all the traits as well. Like, the biggest thing with me when it comes to like Jordan Love, right, is traits. It's the biggest thing you can say is he flashes so much ability to, anticipate throws, to be aggressive, to get the ball in the field, along with having elite arm talent. And I think Herbert has a lot of that as well. And Herbert makes some really flashy plays that Love also can make. But I think both of them just have that super high ceiling. The biggest reason why I have Love just a bit higher is I think I've seen a little bit more out of Love, which is kind of crazy to talk about when, you talk about a guy who had 20 touchdowns and I think like 16 picks last year. But when you look at his accumulative tape, the sophomore tape and that junior tape, I think you see a little bit more, reading down the field, throwing with anticipation. And I think he has a little bit better traits, an upside than a guy like Herbert. Herbert scares me a little bit just because of that Oregon offense. The Oregon offense was very much I'm going to hit you with a screen or it's going to be a vertical play. Quarterback doesn't really have to read much, so that does concern me a little bit. But, again, we're talking about first-round quarterbacks. We're talking about two guys who are, one's going to go probably in the top 10 in Herbert, and the other one's probably going to go in the top 20 in Jordan Love. So we're talking about two pretty good quarterback prospects. So it's kind of a pick your flavor there. But I think Love, when he had the NFL-ready offense, or at least a semblance of an NFL-ready offense his sophomore year, I think he showed a little bit more than what I've seen from Herbert in college. So I like Love a little bit more.
All right, understandable.
Yeah, and Zach, I know this is kind of comparing apples and oranges here, but I kind of think, with a guy like Jordan Love, you saw it kind of in his previous draft picks a little bit, say a Kamoko Turi, a guy who necessarily didn't have the numbers to back it. He didn't have he didn't have double-digit sacks coming out of Rutgers when Chris Ballard drafted him, but you see the potential there, you see the physical traits there, and I think that's a big reason why Colts fans should be and why Jordan Love is being projected to the Colts in certain mock drafts. It's just because there's so much potential there, and like you mentioned, the different offenses, that's obviously a huge transition from college systems to the NFL system, and so I definitely see where you're going there, Zach, and it kind of fits the Chris Ballard model. It really does, as far as physical traits versus actual, college stats, because stats don't always tell the whole story.
Yeah. Ballard is very much a traits over stats kind of guy. Almost every position I've looked at for my Build a Ballard series, if you guys listening are familiar with that series, I try to go position by position and see Ballard's draft history with the Chiefs and with the Colts and kind of nail down what he kind of looks for at certain positions. It's not a perfect model, obviously. Ballard has only had 3 years of real control over a team, but it is kind of a good feel to get that kind of stuff. And honestly, he's never really valued production as much. He wants players to be productive, obviously, and be good players in college, but he's big on traits. I mean, he likes that upside. I mean, we thought, like you said, with Toure, even a guy like Taekwon Lewis, when he took him as high as he did, even Braden Smith, projected to a tackle when he was a guard throughout college. I mean, he likes that upside. So, I mean, Jordan Love definitely fits that to a T.
Yeah. And moving on now, Zach, to round 2 here, number 34th overall pick. I think there's a lot of ways the Colts can go here. Whether that be defensive tackle, say they take a quarterback in the first round, that'd be defensive tackle, wide receiver. There's just a lot of different options here. What do you have here at number 34? What do you think is the best fit here in terms of position and player?
Yeah, so starting at, with 34, there are a lot of ways you can go, like kind of what you were just saying there. Chris Ballard was quoted this offseason saying 3-tech is the biggest part of the defense. It all kind of revolves around the 3-tech on the defensive line, so they definitely could go with 3-tech, even though Danico Autry, I think, wasn't great last year, but he still wasn't bad, which is kind of a common misconception with Colts fans. Either someone's either great or they're horrible. But Danico Autry was fine last year, but I do think they could upgrade that and get another athletic guy in there. So, Blakelock out of TCU is a really good fit there at 34. Neville Gallimore, who is down at the Senior Bowl, is a super athletic guy, still kind of growing into his body a little bit, but he's going to test. He's going to put up some insane numbers at the combine, so that's another one who could, be a fit there at 34. But I also like a couple other positions there. It's not just going to be that 3-tech. I think wide receiver is very much in play at 34. I think Ballard understands the need to get more help for his quarterback, whoever it is. If it's, Phillip Rivers, Jacoby Brissett, Jordan Love, Justin Herbert, whoever, I think he understands he needs to get more help there. And I think some obvious fits there, given, Ballard's history drafting receivers. He loves those high upside, speedy guys. I think Brandon Ayuk out of Arizona State is a huge fit. I think he just kind of checks off every single box that Ballard likes. And then also Jalen Reagor, if he slips out of the first round, which he might not because he's going to probably run 4.2s at the combine. But Jalen Reagor could be another good fit. So those are probably the positions I'd be looking at there at 34. Maybe a corner as well. Damon Arnett out of Ohio State could be a fit. Cam Dantzler out of Mississippi State definitely will check off a lot of Ballard's boxes. But I think wide receiver, defensive tackle would be the obvious looks, given, Costanzo comes back and that kind of stuff. But I think, defensive tackle and wide receiver are probably the obvious fits.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about Jalen Reagor, I think he's the son of former Colts defensive tackle Monte Reagor, if I'm not mistaken there. So that would be kind of a cool connection there. Okay, so staying in the second round, the Colts obviously have another pick. I believe this is their own pick. Number 44 overall in the second round. What position would you say here, Zach? You kind of hit on some of those positions. What player do you think would be available, or you kind of project would be around that area that the Colts would potentially look to draft?
Yeah, so let's just say in this scenario, if we're kind of doing like a live mock draft here, like we went Jordan Love in the first, and say we went either Reagor or Ayuk there at 34, one of those two. I do think that penetrating 3-tech is going to be a big position of need still. So again, maybe Gallimore slips a little bit just because he is so unrefined, but I doubt he would fall all the way to. I think they picked 47, right? Is it 47?
44.
Yeah,
44. So yeah, he might slip to 44, but maybe not. But Ross Blakelock out of TCU would be a good fit. But I do think Ballard, with his love of corners, if Damon Arnett or Cam Dantzler are there, those are two very long physical corners that are just very in your face type of guys, really stout run defenders. They kind of both feel a lot like Rock last year, but I even like Arnett quite a bit better than I like Rock. So I think he'd be really tough to pass up on those guys. So corners maybe not the biggest need on the team. Maybe depending on what they do with this year's contract this off season, but Dantzler, Arnett, I think would be really good fits here for the Colts.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you're right about that, Zach. Is that you can never really have too many good corners. It's always a position that you absolutely need to keep filled every off season, so that way you have the abundance of talent there. And Damon Arnett is definitely a great one. Me being an Ohio State guy, I've grown up just watching Damon Arnett over the last few years. Dude has really come into his own. Honestly, think that the most difficult part about him is just you mentioned I think it was on Twitter earlier this last week how his aggressiveness and his willingness to hit guys coming down from the run or the screens is what makes him great. I think sometimes that's his ultimate biggest issue is just his energy sometimes gets the best of him, and that's what can cause him to get some of these penalties that goes against him. That's his biggest issue. But obviously you spent time watching a few Buckeyes down in the Senior Bowl and everything else. Besides Damon Arnett, if you can name any, do you think there's any kind of guys that are Ohio State guys that might have increased their stock over the last few weeks from what you've seen?
Oh yeah, no, the number one that stands out, and he was a guy I wrote about for Cover One, I think like 2 weeks ago, was guard Jonah Jackson. I absolutely loved him down at the Senior Bowl. I mean, he was probably the second best guard down there, besides Damian Lewis from LSU. But outside of Damian Lewis, I think Jonah Jackson was outstanding. And then I went back to his film because I hadn't watched it before I got down there, and I came away super impressed with his film as well. Like, I mean, he moves really well. He plays pretty mean as well. He kind of runs over some guys. He can get out on the edge, but he can also win in the trenches. And overall as a pass blocker, I wouldn't say he's outstanding, but I do think he's a pretty solid pass blocker. So I think down to Senior Bowl, he definitely improved his stock. To me, I think he's a top 50 player in this class, which is a lot higher than a lot of people. But I think he's going to test pretty well at the combine, and I think he kind of rose up draft boards. But I think he did really well. I think Devon Hamilton had a pretty good Senior Bowl as well, even though, when I went back to his film, I was wondering why he would, be out of the game for 4 or 5 series at a time. It was a really weird kind of rotation they had on the defensive line. But Devon Hamilton, I think, looked really good down at the Senior Bowl. Maybe not a starter in the NFL right away, but I think it's like a 3rd or 4th round guy. I think he really helped his stock as well.
Yeah, and Cody's been one of the guys on this podcast that has constantly been talking about how we need to increase at the guard position on the right side of the offensive line. No offense to Mark Lewinsky, but some people think that we need to increase in that position. So it's good to hear you say that, Damian Lewis and Jonah Jackson and all these other guys that are guards that are going to be potentially 2nd, 3rd round guys that I think we can honestly steal one of them with that 44th pick if Ballard falls in love with one of them. So that's good to hear.
Yeah, for sure. I think there are a couple good interior offensive linemen in this class that the Colts could look at, and also a couple tackles. I think this is a really deep tackle class as well. So even if Costanza comes back, I think there's a ton of options for tackle in this class as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Because you like Ballard even talked about in his press conference, the whole idea of I felt like I didn't have enough depth on the offensive line, and that was something that we've talked about, Derek, on this podcast. Is like, holy smokes, say one of your starters, like the Colts were very fortunate in 2019 that pretty much all their starters played every game. But say one of those guys goes down, then you're kind of in some hot water there. So definitely would address that tackle position somewhere, and hopefully the Colts do that in this draft class. Here, number 75th overall. There's a few options here, but who would you think now? Colts draft, we'll say defensive tackle, 3 technique. What other position do you think they could draft, and who are some guys you think would be around the 75th pick?
Yeah, so again, I think cornerback is always going to be a need because Ballard just loves taking corners. But I think we can also look at other positions that he's kind of invested heavily in the past few years. Those positions that are just going to piss people off when he takes them because he keeps taking them. I think linebackers in play in the 3rd round, which I know that would upset a lot of people. But, when you really look at it, you have Okereke, who's eventually going to be the Mike of the future. I think that that's their plan for him, and I think he's coming along really well. Leonard's obviously gonna be your will, but Anthony Walker after this next year is probably up in the air. He's a good linebacker, but he's not really like a difference maker on the defense. So maybe he's gone after the year, and then outside of that, it's a lot of projects. 2 7th round picks, EJ Speed, who's a 5th round pick, but he's very raw. So I think linebacker could be in play in the 3rd, but I do think that. I think where he's going to go is offensive line, just because, like you said, he loves that depth, and Raven Clark is leaving, but presumably he's going to be leaving, and then Joe Haig, I think, is going to get starter money from another team. So I think he's going to be, the Colts are going to be kind of lacking on offensive line depth coming into this class, and they might double dip at it even. But some guys I really like in that 3rd round pick range, Prince Tega Wanagu out of Auburn. If he slips that far, I don't think he's going to test absurdly great at the combine, which may like drop him that far. But a very powerful guy, still kind of coming into his body and learning a little bit. But he's a very good tackle and guard prospect even. And then Ben Barch is probably my favorite guy there, just because I think he just checks off everything. He's a small school guy, doesn't really have a lot of the, doesn't have that big name value, that big school value around him. But he looked really good at the Senior Bowl. And when I talked to him, when I interviewed him, he said, his pass block, his preferred way to pass block is kind of what the Colts do. And the Colts do this really unique pass blocking with their angle sets and their aggressive pass blocking. And when I was quizzing Barch, and I quizzed, I think like 7 or 8 offensive linemen down there about what their preferred pass blocking is, Barch was the number one guy who was very much in line with the Colts thinking on offensive line blocking. So I think, he has that power. He has a lot of what you look for in offensive line, but he also has already kind of bought into the Colts way of blocking on offensive line. So I think Ben Barch, if he slips to the 3rd round, because his name is kind of rising, but if he's there in the 3rd round, I think Ben Barch would be a really good pick.
So I'm curious, Zach, and you've mentioned it in your articles. I've read it before, but for our listeners, can you kind of talk about real fast, kind of the whole idea of, you mentioned the Colts way of blocking. What does that blocking look like?
Yeah, I mean, I could go on for days about this. It's something that I've studied a lot over the past year. Read, countless Howard Mudd, articles and books, and listened to him on podcasts and stuff. It's a very fun way to block, and it's definitely against, common knowledge. So, the typical person who knows football or studies football has heard of the vertical set. We've all heard of the vertical set, where you're kind of retreating a little bit into the backfield out of your pass sets as a tackle. Well, Howard Mudd's emphasis on pass blocking, especially for tackles, is he doesn't want to wait for these pass rushers to attack the offensive tackles. He wants them to attack those pass rushers. So it's kind of jumping out of your stance and jumping at the defensive end. Now, it's very risky because you can get beat inside, but his thought process is if you can get on them early, get your hands on them quickly, and disrupt that rush immediately at the line of scrimmage, you have a better chance of winning that overall rep and disrupting the play. And overall, I think the Colts pass blocking was much, much better this past year than it was the year before, even though the sack numbers are a lot different, which, a lot of it is due to Jacob Brissett not being as good a pocket presence as Andrew Luck was. But, I think overall that the offensive line really improved, and I think that it really helped them in run blocking as well, because when you have that mindset of, hey, we're always jumping defensive linemen, then when you get to your runs and you are running the ball a little bit more, you're still in that mindset of jumping guys and still attacking, and defensive linemen are a little bit off guard because they don't know what's coming. So overall, you can do a lot of research on it. I think I've written like 3 or 4 articles for it over at Santee Blue. So if you guys want to search my author name with the mud technique or aggressive pass setting, or even Braden Smith scouting reports or something, I'm sure that I mentioned in those. But it's a really interesting topic if anybody listening has the time to look it up. It's I know it's not the most fun looking up offensive line technique, but I really enjoy kind of this new style, and I've definitely converted from being a vertical set guy to an angle set and aggressive set type of guy.
Yeah, and you mentioned Braden Smith. I want to talk about him really fast. What have you seen from Braden Smith now? 2 years in the league. Obviously, he's drafted as a guard. Now he's playing tackle. What have you seen from him? Going from year one, from Dave DeGuglielmo now to Chris Strauser, Howard Mudd, that technique. How have you seen him as a player? Has he, improved? Has he regressed? How has he developed as a player overall in your mind?
Yeah, so year one, Braden Smith was a guard playing tackle. It was very obvious. I think he played really well for it. I think he was very confused in vertical sets. Not like, not that he's dumb or anything like that, but it's really tough to get the footwork down when you change along the offensive line. Even going from right tackle to left tackle is really difficult, but going from guard to tackle is a whole different type of footwork. Yeah, I think the first year was good. In spite of all that, I think that the Colts had to help him a lot, which doesn't really get mentioned a lot. Is they were really helping him that first year. It was running back chips, tight end chips, almost on every single pass play. They were terrified of him in one-on-one. For good reason though. I mean, he's a great prospect and he's a good tackle, but that was it's terrifying when you have that guy who went from guard to tackle mid-season. So they really disguised a lot of his struggles in year one, whereas this year they kind of left him on that island. They helped every now and then, and I kind of wish they would have helped him a little bit more, kind of ease that transition a bit. But he was left on the island a little bit, and the sack numbers kind of went up a little bit on his side. But I think overall what you have in Braden Smith at right tackle is probably a top 2 or 3 run blocking right tackle in football. I think he just dominates on the outside there, and he's great when he can get into space and get to that second level. And then as a pass blocker, I think he's pretty solid. I don't think he's perfect. I think speed rushers can beat him to the outside, and he has occasional struggles with his hand placement. But he's still learning. He's still growing into that role, and I think that right now he's a pretty good right tackle. I mean, I think Pro Football Focus had him as the 100th best player in football this year, which love or hate Pro Football Focus, that is still pretty high praise. And I think, again, I think he's a good tackle. I don't think he's anything special. I think he can get into maybe the top 10 right tackle league or right tackle like rankings throughout his career for sure. Maybe never be like a Pro Bowl guy, but I think, overall you're going to have your right side kind of locked down for a long time and have a guy who's going to be a dominant run blocker and a pretty good pass blocker. And I think that's more than what you would ask out of a typical 35th overall pick in any draft.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, getting back now, Zach, to the draft. Now we're sitting here in the 4th round, 122nd overall. Who are some guys you think would be around that, that range that you think would be on the Colts radar potentially?
Yeah, it's tough when you get into day 3. From talking to agents and talking to coaches and players and stuff, I've talked to a lot over the last couple of years. I mean, when you get to day 3, they basically call it early undrafted free agent period. 4th round is the same thing as 7th round typically, except you're just taking higher shots on guys. So typically if a guy gets to day 3, it's kind of a crapshoot. But I could definitely see, a lot of different options. Again, kind of cornerback, what we've kind of mentioned the last couple of picks here. But I think safety eventually comes into play here just because I think the need for a 3rd or 4th safety with some upside would be an interesting addition to the team. Maybe another receiver, Devin Duvernay, could be there out of Texas, and he's, a really high, very athletic player who can also catch almost anything thrown his way. He's a little bit stiff running his routes, but, as a slot guy, I think he could be really good. So Devin Duvernay would be a really fun pick there and kind of double down on that. Even tight end. I think tight end would be another interesting pick there. I think, in the 4th round, you'd probably be a little too low for Bryson Hopkins or Adam Trautman or any of those kind of guys, but that second tier tight end. Albert O could be there. I don't want to try his last name because I'll just butcher it here on the show. But Albert O could be there. He's a nice pass catcher. There's definitely going to be a lot of guys that stand out at the combine too, tight end wise. So yeah, that could be another option as well. But day 3, I think it can go a lot of different ways. I mean, we saw with Ballard last year. I don't know if I expected a safety I didn't expect him to trade up for a safety in round 4 of last year's draft. So it was definitely a little bit different coming that way. But yeah, there's a lot of options. I think doubling up on receiver would be a really fun way to go, and maybe getting a guy like Devin Duvernay would be a really fun pick.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I did have a question here. So, so obviously, Zach, you had some time to ask some questions with some players, interview some guys. The interview you had with Nebraska defensive tackle Darian Daniels was well put together. I enjoyed listening to it. There was obviously at this time, this is the time where you can find the diamond in the rough for certain kinds of players at this time. And so I guess just the question is there any guys that made a huge impression on you after watching film or anything else at the Senior Bowl that you really didn't have high expectations for going into that?
Yeah. So first of all, I love that you mentioned Darian Daniels interview. That was really fun. That was right after he had the players parade. And he had a super long day. So just having him, coming up there and sitting down with me, I think it was like 9 o'clock at night. So him sitting down with me the day before the game and talking, that was really fun. And yeah, he was definitely a guy who wasn't on my radar. Even throughout the week, he wasn't really on my radar that much until I went back after the interview and looked at some of his highlights throughout the week, and he had a pretty good week. But there was a ton of guys, I kind of mentioned Jenner Jackson. I wasn't really on my radar before that week. Another guy who really stood out was Troy Pride Jr., the corner from Notre Dame. Going into the week, I didn't really know too much about him. I've heard of him before. Notre Dame corners, you definitely hear them, but he was excellent all week. I mean, he was locking down receivers left and right, and he definitely, he went against guys like Denzel Mims throughout the week. He had a couple tough receivers against him, and he had an excellent week. So Troy Pride Jr. was one that wasn't on my radar at all, and I came away super impressed. Trying to think of at least another guy here. Jason Strowbridge was kind of on my radar, a guy that I really liked for the Colts early on in the process, but it kind of fell off my radar going in, and he had an excellent week as well. Really nice guy to talk to, and definitely someone who I think fits kind of that Colts culture there. So, that's another guy who could fit that 3-tech mold maybe on day 3 as well, because I don't think he's going to get up into day 2 range. But day 3, Jason Strowbridge can kind of do that 3-tech and play some 5-tech, which the Colts absolutely love. So he could be an interesting option for the Colts, but he really blew me away throughout that week as well.
Awesome.
Yeah, one more question for you, Zach, and then we'll let you go. I know you're a busy guy. So, Zach, you were down at the Senior Bowl, and I just have to ask, who is your favorite prospect interview and why?
Well, I have so many guys, so I'm trying to think, because I think I got up to like 20 this year, which is really cool. Darian Daniels, I think, will always kind of hold a special place in my heart just because I got to sit down with him and kind of talk with him, and his agent was there and stuff, and we had a really fun time. My fiance was actually one recording too, so it was kind of a cool little sit down there. So I think that one will always be fun. Terrell Burgess was really good, Utah defensive back. He's probably going to go on day 3, but he was a really good interview too. Very lively guy, joking around a lot. I sent one of my buddies from Arrowhead Pride, Chris, over there to interview him afterwards. And when we turned around so I could point at him and show where he was just standing there like, all right, come over here, like doing a little hand motion to come over. So he was a really fun dude. But also, yeah, like Ben Bartch was really good too, because like I said, we talked about him. When I actually interviewed him, he was very quiet, only said a couple words per thing. But when I turned off the recorder, we both kind of were talking about angle sets and doing our pass sets and talking like that way and stuff. And we were actually both getting in the stance and talking about it. So that was a really fun one too. But I think Darian Daniels will probably be the one that sticks out just because, I just think that it's going to be, it was just an interesting interview. Like, it was just really fun to talk to a really good guy like that, and he was really well spoken. And then also having my fiance there, we were just sitting at media row and all that. So yeah, that's one that's going to stick for a while, I think.
Awesome. Well, Zach, thank you so much for coming on the pod, man. We appreciate it. What are you working on now for Stampede Blue or Cover One, or what have you been working on recently?
Yeah, so it's the busy time of year, as you can tell
Mhm.
from me rescheduling this last week. It's a super busy time of year for me. I think coming up tomorrow for Cover One, I'll have an article. Well, tomorrow, depending on when this podcast posts, but Tuesday, I'll have a Damon Arnett piece dropping over at Cover One. It has all 22 film in it and everything about why I love him. I even talk about an interesting Nick Saban story in there. If you guys are interested, it's gonna be pretty funny. But yeah, I rave about Damon Arnett for quite a bit in that article. I absolutely love him. Coming for Stampede Blue, every week I'm going to be doing rookie film rooms on the rookies from this past year and kind of getting through the whole class. I think Paris Campbell's going to be up this week, which shouldn't take me too long to write just because he didn't really have much of a rookie season. Bunch of interviews coming up this week. Austin Hall from Memphis, linebacker. South Dakota State's running back. I have another one coming up this week too, but I don't know. I have a ton of them. Oh, and also on Sunday, if I got to text the guy back, but I should be on Indy Radio on Sunday from 8 to 10 a.m. John Kamisko, I think is his name. He's having me on the radio this Sunday. So if you guys are not too annoyed listening to my voice here on this podcast, tune into that radio show on Sunday. I think I can't. See, I don't live out in Indy, so I don't know. What's your guys' big radio station that has Bowen and all them on it?
Oh, yeah, the Fan. Yeah, 1070.
Yeah, I think that's what it is on
107.5,
Sunday
whatever.
morning.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, I'll have to tune in for that. Yeah,
absolutely, man.
Yeah, should be a good one.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely be looking out for that and looking out for your articles and stuff. Well, we really appreciate it, man. We appreciate you coming on, giving your insight, giving your thoughts on it. Means a lot. And, man, we hope that you have a fun, free agency's coming up soon, drafts coming up soon. So we hope that those are good times, and you get a lot of mock drafts in, a lot of fun before then. So thanks, Zach. We appreciate you, man, as always.
Yeah, of course, guys. Thanks for having me on, and good luck with all your guys' podcasts and work you all are doing this off season.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.